It's hard to believe, and hard for us to believe, but we've been doing BookLab for 10 years.
Where does the time go?
It's a good question. I wonder if the answer is in one of the books we've reviewed over those 10 years.
So, in this episode, we're going to have a little celebration as we look back on a decade of Book Lab.
Welcome to episode 37 of BookLab, the podcast where we check out what's new in the world of popular science books. I'm your host, Dan Falk.
And I'm your other host, Amanda Gefter.
This episode is going to be a little bit different because instead of reviewing new books, we're going to look back and ponder some of the trends we've seen, recall some of our favorite reads, and talk about a few of the science books that got away.
Happy Podversary, Dan.
Happy Podversary, Amanda.
Let's talk books. So, over the last 10 years, and it's still unbelievable that it's been 10 years, but over the last 10 years, we have read books on a number of huge topics. So, things like consciousness, the multiverse, quantum mechanics and the nature of reality, artificial intelligence, the cosmos, genetics, free will. We've also looked at a lot of more niche topics like animal navigation, circadian rhythms, virtual reality, and taxonomy. So it's been a fascinating 10 years with this incredible range of books that we've had the good luck to read.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And I think just, in case our listeners are wondering about this, so lots and lots of popular science books get published every year, if not even almost every month. So honestly, it's just a wheelbarrow full of books that we could potentially review. Now, of course, we don't have time to review even a small fraction of them. And in case listeners are wondering how we choose which ones to review, well, there isn't really a magic formula. Amanda and I have a variety of interests, and they overlap quite a bit, and people will have
Yeah, they
noticed
definitely
they
overlap.
definitely overlap a bit. So there have been quite a few books about space and time, quantum mechanics, the mystery of consciousness, and perhaps not quite as many about the biological sciences, although we have done a few, or climate. There are definitely some subjects that just don't quite get perhaps the coverage on BookLab that one might wish for. But yeah, it's just a lot to it's just an endless whittling down of the potential books. So, for example, since publishers know that I do this podcast, they send me books in the mail. Sometimes because I said, "Can you please send me such and such?" Because they send me a press release, and I say, "Oh, that sounds great. I'd love to have a copy." And sometimes things just like show up. So I get just a lot of books, and yeah, and Amanda, I suspect you're probably in a similar position. Like, the number of books that we theoretically could review is pretty big. The other thing I'll
Yeah.
just remind listeners is that this is a labor of love. We haven't yet figured out how to monetize this podcast. We do it because we love it, and we hope you folks listening are getting something out of it. But yeah, Amanda, just the quantity of books can be a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, we try to sort of keep some amount of variety, or if we see a couple of big important books on the same topic, we'll kind of lump them together into like an episode where we just look at that topic. But in general, we try to mix it up, and so yeah, it's interesting. Like we sometimes like there'll be like a moment where all these books on quantum mechanics come out at one time. But if we do, an episode on a couple of quantum mechanics books and then like a month later there's another one, we're
Yeah.
going to try not to do,
Yeah.
yet another one. So that, is a factor too. It's just like which books happen to come out when.
So over the years, there have definitely been some trends in popular science writing that we've noticed. A trend that sort of occurred before Book Lab began. So Book Lab started in December 2014, and around the turn of the millennium and into the start of the 21st century, there were a lot of these, I don't know what the word is exactly, but narrowly focused or narrowcast books that are about one very specific subject, or which at least based on their titles, claim to be. So you'd have books called Salt or Mauve about the color mauve, or The Shadow Club, a book about shadows, right? So now none of these are exactly what they seem on the surface, because ultimately, like in The Shadow Club, which I read, there's a lot of discussion of like electromagnetism and physics and what did Isaac Newton think about, there's all this sort of history of science stuff. But that trend, I think, has faded away maybe a fair bit. But what
Yeah.
has not faded away are the opposite kind of book, the I guess you would call it like broadcasting instead of narrowcasting, or big topic, or sometimes it's called the view from 30,000 feet because it's like surveying some enormous subject. I mean, an example would be Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*, and we can get talk more about that later. But I would also
Like
put
the view from 30 million years. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. And Sean Carroll's The Big Picture, very much of that sort, and Brian Greene's Until the End of Time. So these sort of very extraordinarily ambitious large books, and the range of stuff they try to cover is substantial. So I think that trend is kind of going strong.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like when I think about sort of physics and cosmology books, which Dan, you and I both, have a special interest in, it seems like looking back, there was sort of this moment where there was a lot of really complicated physics that popular audiences might want explained. So like when Brian Greene's The Elegant Universe came out,
Yes.
that was the book that explained string theory,
Yes.
and Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time explained, black holes and things. So we had a lot of those books. Then there were sort of like the counter reaction books, like the Peter Voigt and Lee Smolin, books about
Mm,
like why string theory is a problem.
that's right. That's right.
But then after that, because there wasn't like a ton of progress in these fields, like just because you're getting to like the very edge of what is known, those kinds of books like ran out of steam a little bit. Like it wasn't like you need like just an explainer, like because they already exist. So then people had to find sort of new ways in to do those types of books. Like there's,
Yeah.
like more like, oh, how could the universe end? Or, you pick some sort of quirky um, way to talk about these big topics. But like, I don't imagine we're going to be seeing just books on like the Big Bang or string theory or something like that. I just feel like there's already so much of that.
Yeah, as I look over at my bookshelf, and there are books, I've got books like Before the Beginning by Martin Rees from the 1990s, I think. And of course, Steven Weinberg wrote the first 3 minutes. That book actually predates Hawking's Brief History of Time. Then I think it was Paul Davies wrote the last 3 minutes. I hope I've got that right. And then, in fact, just a few years ago, Katie Mack wrote The End of Everything. And, to Katie Mack's credit, even though this is a subject that you would think might have been milked for all it's worth. I mean, she kind of found kind of an original way of tackling it. And of course, the physics has progressed a little bit over the last 25 years. So, there's sort of more ideas that are in it that were in some of these earlier books.
I would throw in that list, Timothy Ferris wrote The Whole Shebang
Yeah,
and
I like
Coming
that
of
one.
Age in the Milky Way, which I just remember that. I mean, that was a really formative read for me early
And
on. It was
and
like just such a beautiful book.
yes, for me, so I have both of them on my shelf, and especially Coming of Age in the Milky Way. For those who
Yeah,
don't know it, it's written by Timothy Ferris, who is not a scientist but is a really good science writer. Has written
beautiful
for the New
writer.
Yorker and many other publications. If I just say it's like a history of cosmology, that doesn't do it justice because it's so well done, and all the important ideas are in there, right up to modern particle physics and inflationary cosmology and speculation about black holes and wormholes. But having just checked the publication date, so it actually came out in the same year as A Brief History of Time. So I don't know what was going on then. This was 1988, and of course, Brief History of Time, exploded and just became made Hawking famous. Listeners may remember we had a special episode devoted to that book, marking one of the anniversaries of its publication. But yeah, Timothy Ferris, just so well done, and going back to primary sources to get juicy quotations, and just so nicely written. I always thought if I could ever write a book 45% as good as Coming of Age in the Milky Way, I would be delighted. But
Exactly.
I don't
Yep.
think I've achieved that yet. Yeah, as I think back to the books we've reviewed in BookLab and just sort of comparing them to the ones that are over there on my shelf, some of which, of course, are older, obviously predating the start of BookLab. I'm trying to think of the ones that have really changed the landscape of popular science writing. Now, of course, that applies to a very, very small minority of books because most books are just kind of run of the mill, like, oh, here's another book about neutron stars or something like that. Um, so we've already mentioned Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time, but before that, we had Gödel Escher Bach by Hofstadter in 1979. And in that same year, David Sobel's Longitude came out. Gödel Escher Bach was a remarkable book. It won the Pulitzer Prize, which is a very rare kind of achievement for any kind of science oriented book. David Sobel's Longitude, again, a bit like Coming of Age in the Milky Way. Well, first of all, Sobel is a very talented writer. It spawned an illustrated version of the book. It spawned a television series, and it's just there are certain you and I both like reading about the history of science, but there's certain episodes that just make great stories in the right hands. And that quest to figure out longitude and the story of John Harrison, the clockmaker, and all the obstacles he faced. I mean, even people who haven't got all the way through Gödel Escher back, I do hope people have read Longitude. It's not a long book. Just find it at your local library, read it. Longitude holds up really well. So, yeah, those were both from 1979. We already mentioned A Brief History of Time. That was even more, I mean, of all the books that we've been talking about, Brief History of Time changed the landscape in
Yeah,
multiple
that was a
ways
game
because
changer. Yeah.
yeah, so amongst other things, it got every scientist thinking, I could do that. I could write a book. If Mr. Hawking could do it, what's stopping me? And then everybody with a physics degree decided to write a book. And some of them are fine, but a lot of them are perhaps not necessary. Again, we did an episode sort of looking back at the significance of Hawking's book, but it is, it's a very, at the very least, a landmark book in
I mean,
science.
it's a funny like cultural phenomenon, right? Because in a certain sense, it's not like the most amazing book as a book,
That's true.
or as a
That's
piece of
true.
writing. Yeah, listeners can go back to episode 16 where we did the 30-year anniversary for a whole analysis. But yeah, I mean, it was a combination of sort of Hawking's persona and the mystique around his persona, and then these really sort of mind-bending ideas about the universe that many people hadn't read about before. So yeah, it's not like it's the best piece of science writing, but it definitely was the biggest game changer.
Yeah, it's sort of like he was the Taylor Swift of his time or something. I don't know what the exact right analogy is, but so yeah, a number of circumstances came together to magically make that book into a bestseller, which he didn't see coming, which his publisher didn't see coming. I mean, honestly, nobody really
Yeah,
saw that coming.
yeah.
Um, and another book that, not to the same degree as Brief History of Time or of Longitude, but Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, that was published in 1997, a huge bestseller. It also won the Pulitzer Prize. Diamond has his critics. There are people who accuse him of different things, but Guns, Germs, and Steel is, and I'm not suggesting that people who haven't read it have to go out and read it, but it's so cleverly kind of thought out. I would say the idea of it, perhaps more than the execution, but the idea of it is clever because it starts from this very simple question that Diamond had asked himself because somebody else had asked him, which is why are some nations on some continents prospering and others are struggling or seem to be struggling by comparison? And that is not an easy question to answer, and you may disagree with Diamond's analysis, but I think he's to be applauded for managing to turn that little question into a fairly riveting 450-page book. There's a reason why everybody had that on their bookshelf in the 90s and why a lot of people still have it on their shelf today.
And that definitely sparked a trend that we're still seeing today of these kind of big idea books, big history books. It's almost like it's like the precursor of like a TED Talk kind of book, right?
Hmm.
It's like
Yeah,
like
yeah,
let me take like a somewhat simple idea and try to use it to explain like everything. And obviously that's always going to be like a little bit flawed because nothing can be like that simple, but it makes people feel like they've really learned something or something summarizable anyway. And so
yeah.
yeah, I think people are still following that model quite a bit.
And let me name two authors that are, well, one of them has passed away, but have been working on a parallel trend. So one is Oliver Sacks, and we did review Oliver Sacks's autobiography when that came out a few years back.
Yeah.
His books, now again, it's sort of like medical science. They're a bit different from the kind of regular books that we review on BookLab, but people gobbled up Oliver Sacks. Let's put it this way. I think Oliver Sacks was sort of a beloved figure to the extent that anyone who's a science writer can really be all that beloved. But people really did like Oliver
Yeah.
Sacks, and people really felt that they were getting something significant out of his many books.
Well, I think
Yeah,
Oliver Sacks did something a bit different. I mean, he would take like these very specific cases, right? So
yeah,
cases like patients that he had that had these very unusual neurological disorders, and then sort of use that as a way into the mystery of how the brain works and how consciousness works, and just
yeah,
sort of like our human experience, but coming in through these like very quirky stories. And I think like that was just a formula for success
yeah,
because they were fascinating case studies in and of themselves. And then, he was a very literary writer, and then he was able to kind of turn them into these um yeah, studies of how the mind works, which everyone sort
yeah.
of finds endlessly fascinating.
Yeah. The other, so aside from Oliver Sacks, the other writer that I was going to mention, and we have not reviewed any of his books, but that's Malcolm Gladwell. So, of course, people know Gladwell is a publishing phenomenon of the last 25 years or so, maybe a bit more. Books like Outliers and Tipping Point were enormous bestsellers. I did read them. I have certain thoughts about them, which we
Yeah,
don't
yeah, me
necessarily
too.
need to get into. I mean, the thing is, they're not strictly speaking science books like the ones we've been talking about. I would say they are science adjacent. Gladwell, his thing is going into the social sciences literature, finding some papers, especially finding some studies that, have slightly surprising results or whatever, and then building up a whole thing out of those results and drawing grand conclusions. I mean, one thing, it's a whole
It's
big
like
topic.
turning anecdotes into like
Well, that's right. Yeah, I mean, his enemies would say he's taken
into
anecdotes,
mountains.
and that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. I think in the early days of Tipping Point and Outliers, I think the reviewers, the reviews were largely positive, and I think reviewers were largely on his side. Now, I don't know if what I'm about to say next is just the inevitable result of a person getting big, but eventually the reviewers turned on him. And it's just interesting to see. Like, for those, I won't get into all the details, but those who are curious should look up Steven Pinker's review of Gladwell's, which one was it? I think it might have been Outliers. If not, maybe it was the book after Outliers.
Dan is referring to Pinker's review of What the Dog Saw, published in the New York Times.
Because Pinker just rips him a new one. Like it's not a very generous or warm review, sort of accusing him of not getting the science right and cherry picking the science so that he can
Yeah.
support his. But then
And then we had Jonah Lehrer, who was sort of
oh well, that's a whole.
modeled on Gladwell, and then like, that all went horribly wrong. So
Yeah, right. So that's right. He was accused of, was it plagiarism or was it just self-plagiarism? I
it
can't
was
remember.
self-plagiarism, which
Yeah.
I still maintain is like not a real thing. But no, I think the bigger thing was he actually made up some facts, quote
Yeah.
unquote
Oh, no,
facts.
no, there's not. Yeah.
One
And
was like it was like quotes of Bob Dylan or something, but he fabricated them.
oh yeah, that's just bad. I mean, oh my goodness. Yeah, that's the publishing world and the world of writing and literary this and literary that is strange and it has its own rules, but one of the big rules is don't do that.
Yeah, definitely don't do that.
So Jonah Lehrer got into that particular kind of trouble, and I'm afraid, with so many authors, some of them, how shall we say, their reputations have sunk somewhat as the years have gone by. There was a well-known cosmologist who is no longer welcome on certain campuses for because of his behavior. I mean, unfortunately, it's not just one individual. I mean, in the old days, Richard Feynman was sort of a hero of popular science communication, but now that we know some of the things that Feynman did, he's not quite talked about in such glowing terms. Depending, it all depends on which corner of the internet you're in.
Right,
I
right.
suppose in some corners of the internet, he's still a
Still a
hero.
hero. Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's a funny thing. I mean, science is a very like small world in a certain sense. And it's not, people who scientists and science writers who get, me too'd, or it's not going to be like the same kind of effect of, some big Hollywood influencer, but I think there is a real like phenomenon where you get these, men who have created this persona of like knowing everything, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the science part of it that's like specific. It's like they like have all the answers and have the most rational mind, and they and it's like its own kind of weird power trip. And so you're gonna get people who end up like abusing that and using it for nefarious purposes, and we've had some of those, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've alluded to it in the case of some of the scientists. I'm afraid there have also been some philosophers and some philosophers who've written popular books that also fall into this category. So,
Yeah, I mean, so I was looking back through our episodes and trying to pick out, what were my favorite books or the ones that really stuck with me. And there's a lot to talk about there. I mean, I'll say maybe generally like the ones that stuck with me tend to be like the quirkier,
hmm,
like sort of offbeat science books or philosophy books that we've looked at. But one of them, just to make my list, was this book called Prehension by Colin McGinn, the philosopher
oh
of
yeah,
mind and language.
right.
Which was about like the role that the hand played in the evolution of mind and language.
Yeah.
And it was, I don't know, I absolutely loved this sort of gem of a book, but unfortunately, McGinn was me too'd, and so I have to kind of do that cognitive dissonance thing of separating the book from the author.
So we've already talked about what I think were some of the game changers from back in the 20th century and in the 21st century, and especially in the last decade in which BookLab has been going. So it's hard to think of books that really are of the magnitude of Guns, Germs, and Seal, or Longitude, or Brief History of Time, or Good Lusher Back, but some that are. And I think, as you were just saying, we tend to remember the provocative ones. So our mathematical universe. Now, this was way back in episode one, so this literally was 10 years ago. But Max Tegmark's Our Mathematical Universe had this very grand idea. Is the universe made of mathematics? And he sort of pushed it and milked it and made an entire book out of it. Not every reviewer loved it, but it was provocative and memorable. Superintelligence. Now that's sort of in a different category. This is by Nick Bostrom, but the problem is that that was a book about how AI is going to change everything. And since that book came out, that we reviewed it in episode 4. So since that book came out, a lot of other books about how AI is going to change everything have also come out. So and not to mention the naysaying books like AI is stupid and you're stupid
Yeah.
for being into it, right? So it's launched its whole counter industry as well. I've already mentioned Sean Carroll's The Big Picture, Until the End of Time by Brian Greene, so I don't need to get into that so much. Reality Plus by David Chalmers, again, about the simulation hypothesis. Now, you might think the simulation hypothesis is stupid. You wouldn't be alone if you thought the simulation hypothesis was stupid, but provocative. It's not the sort of book that, some of the ones I've been rattling off here, I'll just mention as an aside. I get people send me these books in the mail. They tend to accumulate because I'm old school, so I prefer to read the physical
Oh, me
copy.
too.
And then it's like, my apartment is not huge. So eventually I have to get rid of most of them have got to go. But there's some that, oh yeah, I gotta keep that. So some of the ones that I've just been mentioning, absolutely, I've kept because they've left their mark and I'm probably going to want to be dipping into them again and again. And in fact, the big picture and until the end of time, I have been. I mean, even though it's only been a few years, I've been re-dipping into them just to check, maybe I'm writing an essay or an article and I just need to remember what is the current thinking about such and such. And I turn to them. And yeah, just very recently, Philip Ball's The Book of Minds, definitely a keeper. So I guess just to say that, well, there's a whole spectrum, right? And there's some of them just leap out as keepers, some of them a little bit less so.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to jot down like this list of, what have been the ones that really, really stuck with me over the last 10 years of doing book lab. And, it's interesting. I mean, in a way, they're not any of the types of books that we've been talking about. They're like these sort of smaller but maybe more creative like approaches to science writing. I think I was trying to think like, is there something that they all have in common? And here's what I think it is. I think there's the type of book that tries to explain science by giving analogies and metaphors from like everyday life, right? So it'll be like, let me explain how entropy works. Like, you know how you have to put in energy to clean your room, but then it becomes a mess, right? So it's like you're trying to explain the science and you're using everyday life to do it. But then there are books that do the reverse, where they're actually trying to get at some emotional truth or some truth about like human experience, um, and then use the science as the metaphor. I don't know. That's like the best way I've come up with to explain it. But so the ones that I've listed that do this are there's a book called Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu
Yeah,
Miller. That was in
yeah,
episode 27. And it's about, it purports to be this like sort of biography of David Starr Jordan, who was doing this taxonomy of fish. Um, but it ends up being this very, very, I don't even want to give anything away. If people haven't read it yet, you definitely should. But it's just not a book. It's not what it seems. And it's very personal and emotional. And has to do with like how we categorize things and the sort of harm that can do.
yeah, yeah.
And yeah, it was just a beautiful, beautiful book. Another one was Unflattening by Nick Susanis, which I talked about in episode 7. And this was a graphic novel. So this is really different than our usual thing. But it was about having multiple perspectives and the power of like embracing diverse ways of seeing. And that it's just an absolutely beautiful book. That's a great like gift to give somebody if you need to still get a gift at this point. And I think he's been working on another one too. I'm sure these the drawings are just incredibly detailed, and but it's like very, it's MIT Press, I believe, and it's very sciencey, but just like this incredible creative work. Only the Longest Threads by Tasneem Zahra Hussein was a novel about the
Yeah.
history of physics. We talked about a number of Richard Powers novels,
I was going
including
to
The
bring that up. Yes, because
Overstory.
after, although I had not read The Overstory at the time you reviewed it as a nightstand piece, but I did subsequently read it. Super interesting book. To remind listeners, although the vast majority of the books we review are nonfiction books, sometimes a work of fiction comes along and,
Yeah.
without the science, the book wouldn't have happened. And I think some of those Richard Powers books are in that category.
Absolutely. And that one won the Pulitzer. So that's back in episode 21. But just yeah, beautiful book about trees. And the other novel that we talked about, which also I think Barack Obama talked about this one and made it like a very popular book, but it was called When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin
Mhm.
Labatut, Chilean
Yeah,
writer.
yeah.
This was in episode 29. So this was like a fictionalized account of like the history of quantum mechanics and physics in a way. But it was just like an absolutely beautiful work of literature. But like it had these little fictional elements, and that was sort of part of the whole conceit of the book, playing with ideas about like uncertainty and sort of our in quantum mechanics and our unraveling of our understanding of reality. And so using these kind of like this growing fictional element to like kind of confuse what we really know and
Mm.
what we really don't know. It was really, really cleverly done. And he had another book that just came out last year, which we didn't talk about, The Maniac, which was like
Mm.
a fictionalized account of the life of John von Neumann. And yeah, so these have been like, these really those are the ones that have really stuck with me, that are almost like works of art as much as they are of science.
And speaking of this intersection between art and science, I was got now I have mentioned this previously, so I won't dwell on it. But when someone who is out there writing novels or writing plays or making movies, and you know that they have really absorbed something from science and really taken away something and then used that to inspire their art, I mean, the results can be incredible. The only catch is there's now so much of it that not all of it is incredible. But I think just in our last episode, I mentioned Michael Frayn's play Copenhagen. I think sort of that's a
Yeah.
classic example of this, where
Amazing. Yeah.
the science informs the structure of the play, but then also the subject matter of the play is about, or centers on this advancement in science that's underway, and then with a lot of political shenanigans happening around it. Another one very much in that vein is Tom Stoppard's play Arcadia.
Yes.
Again, if people have a chance to see it, they really should. But these are the tip of the icebergs. I mean, those are two examples that got a lot of prizes and attention and that sort of thing. But there's just a whole world of this kind of thing. So it's I would say it's no longer a rare thing for a novel to be up to speed on the science. And well, I mean, obviously science fiction has been doing this for I was going to say 100 years, but Frankenstein is 200 years old. So let's say for about 2 centuries.
Yeah, and then of like the more traditional types of science books, the ones that I jotted down as being favorites, from the BookLab archive were The Idea Factory, which was all the way back in episode 2 by John Gertner. This was like a history of Bell Labs that I just
Mm.
thought was
Mhm.
fantastic. And there was also The Blind Spot, which was a recent one we did, episode
No,
35.
it may not be universally seen as a favorite, but yes,
Yeah.
I will not.
We
I
had
will
some,
not.
some
We
disagreements
had
on
some
that
back and
one.
forth on it. Healthy,
Um,
healthy, healthy back and forth on that one.
exactly, healthy debate. There was also Spooky Action at a Distance by George Musser. That was a
Mhm.
great physics book in episode 12. Black Hole Blues by Jana Levin, we did in episode
Yeah,
13.
I like that one.
Yeah. Oh, and then we did episode 20. We looked at a few books on quantum mechanics, but one of them was Beyond Weird by Philip Ball, which I thought was another really good one.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's amazing looking back how many books we covered.
We have, and as we said off the top, I mean, we do, the number of books to potentially review is enormous. And I was going to say a few just quick words about some of the ones that got away. And again, this is just a selection because a lot of things got away, but a hugely popular and successful science writer has been James Gleick. People may remember from the old days, from the around the turn of the millennium, he had a book on chaos. He had a very slim but excellent biography of Newton. I think it was just called Newton, or possibly Isaac Newton. At any rate, it was very good. And then in 2016, so I'm not quite sure why we didn't review it, but in 2016, he had a book on time travel called Time Travel, A History. Now, it's a good book. I actually can't, and I read it, but I can't speak about it with super duper objectivity because I'm very jealous of the fact that he wrote it. Now, my book, In Search of Time, had already come out at this point, and I have a chapter on time travel in Search of Time. But if I had taken my chapter and expanded it into a book, it would be this. So, so on the one hand, kudos to Gleick for just doing it instead of me in who lives in the land of woulda, shoulda, coulda. So Gleick actually did it. It's a good book. Yeah, I won't try to give a
Yeah, that
detailed
was a good
review.
book. He had
Yeah.
another one a few years before that, before Book Lab, called The Information, that was also very good.
Mm, mm. And another one that got away. Now, in this case, I have to confess I haven't actually read it, but I really wanted to. It was by Joseph Heinrich, and it was called "The Weirdest People in the World." And in the title, the weird part, WEIRD, is in like extra heavy bold type. So the weirdest people in the world. The subtitle is "How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous." Very thick, like just paperweight or doorstop heavy in terms of mass. And I know roughly what it's about, even though I unfortunately didn't get around to reading it. It's about everything that gets published in the social sciences journals, all these classic experiments, they're all done with undergraduates in the United States or sometimes in Britain or whatever. So they're skewed as a result of the slightly peculiar culture that these undergraduates live in. So WEIRD is an acronym. It stands for Western Educated Industrialized. What's the R stand for? Rich, I think. Industrialized, rich, and D is probably developed. Or sorry, D is democratic. That's it. So, in other words, these experimental research subjects are weird compared to just if you randomly pick people from other cultures, you might very well be getting different. The studies would perhaps be drawing different conclusions. So I just thought that would be a really interesting book to get into, and it sat on my shelf, and it sat on my shelf, and then I just gave up and took it to the used bookstore, and they gave $5 for it or something like that. So I regret, dear listener, that I never got to say my piece about that book. I would say it's probably interesting, but I haven't actually read it. So yeah, I mean, there's just like we can't do everything, and I mean, we've done well. What in some of the episodes we do 3 books, and some of them we only do one or two. But that is what more than 100. I mean, I'm sure it's more than 100. So we have done a lot.
Yeah, some other ones that got away. The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, the New Yorker
Hmm,
writer.
yeah,
That was 2016. That one won a Pulitzer.
yeah.
That would have been a good one to discuss. There were also two Ed Young books.
That's right. We did, I think we did one of his though, right?
No, we didn't.
Oh, well, we should be ashamed of
I
ourselves.
know. We are ashamed of ourselves.
I mean, he's good. He's just objectively a really, really good writer, as people
Great
may know
science writer.
from reading his
Yeah.
work in the Atlantic or
It's funny that we
elsewhere.
feel like we did it because that's exactly right. I mean, yeah. There was a I Contain Multitudes was 2017 and then An Immense World was 2023. So those would have both been great ones. Um, Another one that got away was 2018 Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind. That would have been a nice one to do
Hmm.
at the time. Um,
So, of all of these books, some of them go on the bookshelf, some of them just you donate to charity or whatever. But some of them, a few of them, have really entered the popular culture and have really come to kind of take on lives of their own. And I think we've already briefly alluded to Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*, but I think of all the books we reviewed, *Sapiens* is most clearly in that category. Now, so this was episode 9. When we reviewed it, we did not know it was going to become a runaway bestseller. We didn't know that it was
I
going
would
to.
not have guessed that either, I have to say.
Yeah, something that distinguishes Harari and Malcolm Gladwell and just a very, very small number of these authors is that when they hit the big time, like they really hit the big time, they get invited to the Silicon Valley, speaking circuit. I think you were sort of alluding to TED Talks earlier, Amanda.
Yeah.
These people just, once they get the spotlight, they really get the spotlight. Maybe Steven Pinker as well. We actually haven't said very much about Pinker, and we've not reviewed any of Pinker's books. Again, they're not exactly, well, I mean, they're more about like psychology and the social sciences, of which we unfortunately have reviewed less of. But I mean, Pinker is admittedly huge. But yes, getting back to Harari and *Sapiens*, well, it's hard for me to remember exactly what was going through my head as I was reading it. I thought, okay, he's a good writer. It is again the sort of the view from 35,000 feet, like he's looking at the entire history of humankind. But I guess the question is, do we agree with everything that Harari says in *Sapiens*? I mean, it's very clever. He's got clever analogies. I don't say goes out on a limb. I mean, he's trying to draw conclusions about economics, about religion, about the origins of religion. It was all very interesting, but I mean, what do you think, Amanda? How well does *Sapiens* hold up now?
Well, it's funny. I think, the popularity has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. Like my opinion of it has maybe gone downhill since. I'd have to go back and listen to episode 9. I don't actually remember exactly what I thought about it at the time, but this is one of the dangers of like becoming this kind of public figure where like now he's like brought onto the news to like comment on, whatever. And I saw something recently, where he was talking about ChatGPT and telling this story about how ChatGPT hired like a human task rabbit to solve a CAPTCHA puzzle for it. Anyway, I watched this news clip and it just sounded so preposterous that I then went and looked up like the actual report of what happened. And it was like absolutely like the story that he went on the news and told was absolutely untrue, like
Yeah,
not even a little bit true. And it was
yeah,
just,
yeah,
it struck me as like either he was just totally duped by this story, which like that's not a good look for him as a journalist, or it was just really intellectually dishonest. I don't know which, but it definitely skewed my opinion a bit. But he's got this kind of AI doomsday kind of thing going on, and
yeah.
um, yeah, I don't know. I don't have the most positive things to
Yeah.
say.
Well, it's interesting. And then, after *Sapiens*, so that was the only one of his books that we reviewed. But after that, he went on to write *Homo Deus*. By the way, we did review a conceptually similar book. We reviewed *Life 3.0* by Max Tegmark, sort of looking at where things are heading. But I did read *Homo Deus*. In fact, I think I interviewed Harari for something that I was working on at that time. And again, super provocative. Like it's not, nobody's going to put down *Homo Deus* partway through. Um, but there was a speculation about the far future and wouldn't it be nice to live forever? And there were just some things that kind of bothered me a little bit. I mean, I'm mentioning this because it's slightly fresher in my head than *Sapiens*, although by now both of these are some years old. But he has this thing where he says, if you were offered 10 more years of life, like whenever you were about to expire or whatever, if you were offered 10 more years of good health, wouldn't you take it? And he writes this because he imagines that you'll say, yes, yes, give me the 10 more years. But it's all, it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's deceptive. It's not really what it seems to be because that offer is fiction. Like no one is offering that. So you just have to, I mean, it's like saying, I don't know if and you get to date Scarlett Johansson for the 10 year. I don't know, like it's just made up. It's just pure fiction. And so the reality is so much more complex and nuanced. I mean, how much energy should be devoted to extending people's lives, or say to just extending the lives of Silicon Valley billionaires, right?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, how much money that might have gone into curing malaria should go into letting billionaires, instead of living to 93, live to 123? Is this really where we're going? And there's some other, I don't want to, dwell on this one book too much, but towards the beginning, somewhere in the preface or the introduction, he says something like, humanity in the 20th century, humanity rubbed its eyes and awoke as if from a bad dream. These are not the exact words, but there were visions of mushroom clouds and barbed wire and something else. And that, but with all of this behind us, what new vision awaits us? Again, I don't mean to, like, I didn't get that exactly right, but the quote is, something to that effect.
Yeah.
And it suggests that there's this organized, humanity decides what it's going to do next based on some kind of unified approach or something. And there's just nothing like that happening. And you only have to turn on the news to see all the
Yeah. Yeah.
horrible stuff that's unfolding. And again, the world is full of nuance. I mean, horrible things are happening and wonderful things are happening, but they're happening at the same time. And I don't think humanity is rubbing its eyes as if awakening from a bad dream. It's just bumbling along in the dark, one somewhat bad dream after another, hoping to find something better. So, again, not to pick, hey, look, he's a good writer. He knows, I'll give him credit. He knows how to write provocative books. Oh, and I will just mention, he has a fresh new book out called Nexus. I haven't read it yet. It seems to be about the history of information networks, but I believe, like all his other books, I believe he draws sort of grander things from it. So perhaps, Amanda, we'll have to discuss this, but perhaps that will be one of our upcoming reviews, possibly.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think like speaking of like sort of trends and things, I think we were sort of saying earlier, like Big Bang, string theory, these things are sort of have run their course in a way in terms of just the publishing world. But AI, I think, is having its moment, and I think now with ChatGPT, like it takes a couple of years usually for a book to go from conception to being on a shelf in a store. And I imagine we are about to see like an explosion of books about ChatGPT.
Yes, or by Chat GPT. Yes,
Yeah, God
I mean,
forbid.
God
Yeah.
forbid. But since you mentioned it, and so this is, I think, a danger with one of these books. Like, I mean, I love reading articles, whether it's in the Atlantic or New York or wherever, about how large language models or AI in general is changing things. I mean, I'm sure you've read a lot of those articles too, and they're often absolutely fascinating, and they make you think about what's going to happen. If 30, I forget the exact number, but many tens of thousands of people in the United States work as truck drivers. Well, what happens when they're not needed anymore, right? That's just the tip of the iceberg, right? The world is just changing very, very quickly. And so it's a challenge for people writing these books. Like, how do you know the book isn't going to be completely out of date? Maybe even by the time it goes to press, right? So it's just a challenge, I think. I mean, it's just changing so fast. It's hard to
Yeah,
keep up.
yeah, absolutely. The other author who's sort of like a phenomenon in his own right, I mean, maybe not of the Harari status, but is Carlo Rovelli.
Hmm.
He's a physicist and writes physics books, but has broken through in a way that sort of few physicists do in terms of just popular culture. Like his books are hugely popular. We reviewed Seven Brief Lessons in Physics in episode 11. We also did his book The Order of Time.
Yeah.
He's had a few others, but I think we
Yeah.
just like couldn't do endless Ravelli books,
Yeah.
even though I would actually be happy to. Helgoland was the newest, I believe, 2020. Although maybe there's an even newer one. There was one on Anaximander. Or,
I can't remember which one of those is the actual latest, but
yeah,
yeah, I, I
exactly.
read I read Helgoland. It's very good.
Very good. Yes. I mean, the thing about Ravelli, well, first of all, he writes very short books, which I think that those
Yes.
sell well.
Give credit. Yes.
but I don't think he's doing it just to sell books. I think that's like actually his style of writing. It's like very sparse but very poetic at the same time.
Yeah.
And he's able to like summarize very, very deep ideas in physics very succinctly and beautifully at the same time. And it's just a very unique skill. So I'm pleasantly surprised that people love it as much as they do, because I think it should be loved that much.
And let me just, so I'm on board with that assessment.
Yeah.
I would say when, you know, you walk into a bookstore, I guess down there, maybe it's Barnes and Noble. Here we have like Indigo and Chapters or what's left of them. I mean, honestly, a lot of these stores now sell like throw cushions and
Right.
candles and junk more than they sell books.
Mugs.
But
Yeah.
you know, if you hunt around enough, you'll eventually find the books. And you know, you might see a popular science book that's 600 pages long, and you might see one that's 200 pages long. And it is not, or at least not automatically, the case that the person who wrote the 200-page book was kind of lazy and didn't feel like doing that much research, and they had some appointments or whatever, you know, they just couldn't do it. So they settled for writing this briefer account. Now, the one that's 600 pages long, if you're lucky, you know, it has more stuff in it, there's more ideas in it, it's very thoroughly researched, and maybe it has a lot of endnotes, and that's great. But the 200-page book, if it's done well, has achieved something else, which is what you've just said, which is that the author found a way to convey complex ideas with brevity and yet without losing the most important ideas. So
Yeah.
Ravelli is one of, I mean, there are a few others, but I mean, maybe Deva Sobel. I mentioned that just because I'm looking at, I see her book Longitude on the little table where I just put it down. So I give her credit for that. But yes, to his credit, Ravelli is one of these authors that is able to convey complex ideas in a relatively brief space. And as you've said, Amanda, with a little bit, you know, kind of poetic, he really has a distinctive style. So kudos to him. I was going to say, you know, with regard to which books have stuck with us, certain books are more provocative than others. And this isn't to say that the ones that aren't provocative are necessarily bad. I've mentioned some of the hefty books that go through the latest findings from cosmology or particle physics, and that's great, even if they're not necessarily going out on a limb and saying, here's my bold alternative idea. But of course, there are also books like that out there as well. One that we reviewed, I mean, it was actually just a few episodes ago, so is still pretty fresh in my mind. And that was when we reviewed Robert Sapolsky's Determined and also Kevin Mitchell's Free Agents. And Free Agents was basically perfectly good with a few little issues that people can go back and listen to that episode for. But Determined, boy, it's really stuck with me because there's so many things where I just wanted to scream as I was reading it, and some of those things are in that episode. But um, his argument, very briefly, is that everything is determined, and that the laws of physics combined with the laws of biology and the laws of sociology just mean that everything is going to happen is what was inevitably going to happen. I mean, there are a lot of things to be said about that. One of them is if the physics tells you that stuff is just going to happen, then it actually doesn't matter whether the biology and the sociology tell you that or not, because it's not like they're going to defeat the physics, right? So there's that. But it's I mean, I would sort of half jokingly say that if Sapolsky is right, then every single one of these other books is wrong because they all talk about. I mean, think about *Sapiens*, right? Saying, well, this happened and that led to that, and the agricultural revolution led to X, Y, or Z. But you know, if Sapolsky is right, all these things just it was all just inevitable that all these things are going to unfold. Um, and I think, you know, he received a mixture of reviews. I was sort of skimming the internet and whatnot. The reviewer at Undark, I forget who it was, gave Sapolsky a positive review. Quite a lot of others, how shall we say, took him to task for some of his extreme ideas. For example, I think it was Philip Ball, I forget in which publication, but he said something to the effect of, look, if you're saying that free will doesn't exist, okay, but you're basically saying that human beings don't exist. And I think that gets it exactly right.
Yeah.
Like, if your argument against free will is, oh, well, you know, I took apart this bunny rabbit and it turned out it was just made of atoms, so sucks to be a rabbit. Rabbits can't possibly make decisions. Well, you know, and of course, if you take apart a human, you find neurons, and if you take apart the neurons, you find atoms, and you're not going to find free will going on down there. But this is a big but you're not going to find a sense of humor. You're not going to find emotions. You're not going to find literary creativity. I know you're just like none of those things exist at the micro level, and it's absurd to look for them there. So if you want to say free will doesn't exist, that's fine as long as you're talking about a universe where nothing else exists either, right? All these other macroscopic things don't exist too. So that's my I know I yeah, I could go on about it, but that's I think you know, and look, he's a nice guy. I interviewed him. I'm sure he's a cool professor. I'm sure every student that had him as a prof is glad they had him as a prof, but I think he goes out on somewhat of a limb. So that book, which again was just a few episodes ago, but that one has stuck with me. So yeah, but a book
And
can.
that book wouldn't exist if you took it apart into atoms.
And also, should he be given credit for writing it if he was inevitably going to have written it? I mean, a lot of these things just, yeah, not sure how much scrutiny they want. But at any rate,
Yeah, so I mean, it's been a really interesting 10 years talking about books, everything from free will to black holes to everything in between. And yeah, maybe I'll just take a moment to like thank our listeners. It's so nice to know that there are people out there who love science books the way we do, and we really appreciate you listening in on our conversations. And I hope you've gotten something out of them over the years. But just thank you for listening.
I'll second that. And you know, Amanda and I do this because we love it. I mean, if anybody has any clever ideas about how to monetize it, I guess let
Please
us
let us
know.
know.
But we are delighted that you tune in and that you've been following us. Some of you have been following us from the beginning. So yes, as Amanda says, thank you for doing that. And there, you know, the books keep arriving and people keep publishing them.
We'll keep
We
talking about them.
That's right. I'm happy to keep reading them. And Amanda, I think you're probably also
Yeah,
happy to keep reading them. So we
yeah, we're in.
yeah, so expect more to come. You've been listening to episode 37 of BookLab. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and on SoundCloud. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/booklabpodcast. And do look for Amanda and myself on your favorite social media platforms, including Blue Sky.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Book Lab.